Hello and welcome back to yet another episode of Matrickz Tech Talk. Today I'm super excited to have Marc Hoag all the way from California here in my studio. Welcome to Matrickz, Marc.
Es freut mich, hier zu sein.
Wow, that is impressive.
That's all I know after 1 month of German.
In many of my discussions, when it goes to safety and security, the legal aspect comes over. And I have been trying to get in touch with someone who is an expert in that field. With that, saying that, I'm going to introduce a little bit about you. Marc is a 2-time startup founder, California licensed attorney. He is the founder and the host of the Autonomous Cars with Marc Hoag podcast. And he's the founder and the principal partner of Hoag+Co, a global autonomous vehicle and urban mobility company that provides consultancy to the industry and based on California, Amsterdam, and Paris. He did his undergrad from UCLA with an engineering heavy track. He's really passionate about automotive industry, autonomous vehicle, and one quote that I really love of what Marc says, the greatest step change in humanity since the Industrial Revolution is autonomous vehicle. Having said that, I'm going to give it over to you, Marc. Why don't you tell our audience a little bit about your passion?
Yeah, I mean, despite being, challenged on that quote, that indeed are autonomous vehicles the greatest step change, why not say AI? I agree that AI might be from the point of view of enabling other technologies, but I think from the point of view of humanity as a whole, I think the impact it'll have on life really is the biggest thing. For me personally, my interest in AVs comes from a few different angles. My background mostly, at least academically, I started at UCLA as an astrophysics major. I did nearly 4 years of essentially pre-engineering track courses of physics, also chemistry and math. Finished up with econ, weirdly enough, before going to law school. But I've also been a thoroughbred car guy. My dad used to race competitively. I've done track days. I love cars. And in a funny sort of way, that's why for me, really this new era of autonomous cars is such a big deal. It's the obvious logical next step. And the idea that we shouldn't have this, that wouldn't make any sense.
I totally agree with you. I mean, people can say that AI is the next big thing. However, this is the blend of AI and transportation. In my opinion, mobility was going to change because of drone technology, because of AVs, because of probably Hyperloop and space technology. We'll see a massive change. And autonomous driving somewhere AI and transportation is blending together. Autonomous vehicle is something that we haven't seen in the past. So we don't know how to deal with it. We don't know how to deal with it in terms of regulations, technically, and also in a sense of a legislation. How are we approaching toward it, and what is the right way?
Well, that's not a loaded question at all. Let's see. I mean, look, at a really high level, you're right. Frankly, maybe for better or worse, I don't know yet. Yeah, nobody knows what they're doing. At least I can speak only to the US primarily, right? So, as you probably know, things are effectively in states' hands, which I think is the right way to do it. Again, just starting super high level, I just want to say I think that eventually it must be the case that eventually we have federal regulation. And I'm sure during the course of our conversation tonight, I'll have a chance to share with you my analogies to the aviation space. And I think that we're going to see a lot of overlap. And there's a lot to learn there's a lot to learn from the aviation space. And I would imagine we're going to apply a lot of that to the autonomous vehicle space as well.
So the legislators and the industry, what is happening right now, the industry is, in terms of technology and sort of know-how, far ahead of the legislators. Yes. The legislators are not technically informed, or they don't have the know-how to make the legislation.
Isn't that usually how it goes?
It's
but it's especially
so
now, that's true.
Especially so now, and the industry will set the rules of the game. Yeah. Do you think there is a danger there, or?
It depends how you look at it, right? If we continue to focus on the AV space based on the 5 different levels of autonomy, right? Mm-hmm. So, in general, I'm actually a huge proponent of, for levels 1, 2, and 3, let's enable it to be in the company's hands and let the states regulate however they want. My concern comes once we start approaching level 4. So, for example, you look at Tesla. Once they deploy their Model 3 taxi fleet, as it were, or once cruise automation, say, unleashes their little Chevy Bolt autonomous cars all over the streets at level 4, and eventually one day level 5, this then needs to transition to federal regulation. And okay, I'll just kind of dive into one of my analogies from aviation. If you look back at the history of Airbus, say, when Airbus brought over fly-by-wire technology, this was an exclusively military type of thing that nobody had ever applied to commercial aircraft in, the early 80s? So I guess the Airbus project first began in the mid 70s. And so when Airbus said, hey, we've got this new aircraft, I guess it was the Airbus A300, the question was, well, we don't know how it's going to do, so why don't we at least compare it to the status quo? Boeing. If you guys are at least as safe as Boeing, then it's probably okay. We don't even have such basic framework as that. We don't have any standards, we don't have any frameworks, and this is why I think that, indeed, let the states regulate up through level 3, but once you get to level 4 and above, you're going to need to have federal regulation. You're going to need standards.
Coming to state safety and security a little bit. When something happens today, when a human driver is diving, you have the driver takes a lot of liability.
Yep.
Now, we have different players now. This kind of players did not exist till today. We have the automotive manufacturers, we have the tier 1 suppliers, tier 2 suppliers, and then we have absolutely a new type of player, companies like Uber, Waymo, who are just providing the autonomous driving software for their fleet.
Not to mention the hardware manufacturers who produce the tech, right? The LiDAR, the computer vision,
They're the tier 2 and so on in the supply chain. Now the driver is not liable because he's not driving. Mm-hmm. And we have the owner of the vehicle. So who is liable for what?
So you'll probably hear me saying a few times tonight, I'm a huge fan intentionally trying to simplify things. I don't think we need to make this such a complicated question. That said, and I'll get to your question directly in a moment, I do think we need a few new definitions. So again, looking to aviation, we used to talk about pilot and co-pilot or captain and first officer. Really today, the terms that are used are the PF and the PNF, if I said that right, pilot flying and pilot not flying. Similarly, with autonomous cars, we're going eventually to need, I think I've come up with 4 different categories. So we've got the owner driver, the owner not driving, the owner passenger, and the passenger not owner. Basically, that would be the pure passenger, right? And so I guess my point is that once you have those 4 definitions etched in stone, from there we can then determine liability, right? So if you look at so we said the lowest bound of potential liability. So a non-owner, non-driver, that's the pure passenger, right? Obviously they can't have any liability unless they took some intentional act to, sabotage a system and do some harm, right? Sure. Obviously they can't be liable. So what do? You go through the chain of, shall we say, the hierarchy of potential liability targets until you find out the solution. Another aviation analogy, you look at the 777 crash at Heathrow several years ago, British Airways, and they were able to trace the liability all the way to the manufacturer of the fuel.
Yeah.
Like the actual refinery.
Absolutely.
I mean, that's incredible.
That is incredible. Having said that, I totally understand the analogy that's coming from aviation industry. Compared to autonomous vehicle, the complexity of autopilot is much simpler. We have to accept that. And there will be way too many scenarios compared to aviation. Yep. There are 3,500 people dying every year in Germany for car accidents. There were like 100 people died from one plane crash, and the news media was all over it.
Sorry, hang on, 3,000 per year in Germany?
3,500 per year.
So we have nearly that many in the US per month. Granted, the populations are quite different between the countries, but even so, that's just staggering.
The comparison is, although there are way less people dying from the aviation industry, the focus is heavily toward that, and the car accidents don't get that much of focus. Sure. It's so regular, but the volume is huge. Yeah. Now, if the manufacturer will have to take that kind of liability in the same fashion as aviation industry, it is going to be a risky game for them, don't you think?
Intuitively, yeah. On the other hand, we've already seen some manufacturers come out and accept that fully, right? So Volvo. Mm-hmm. Volvo said a few years ago, I think it was part of their Vision 2020 mission statement. They said, look, no human will ever be killed or seriously injured in any Volvo ever, and if they are, we will accept full liability. Boom. I mean, that's pretty cool.
That's bold, yes.
Yeah, but when you think about it, it's not just bold, it's also necessary, because to the point that you keep alluding to, it must be that way, because again, if you've got a non-owner, non-driver, it must be the case that the manufacturer, or at least companies with whom they've worked to produce and provide that transport. It must be the case that they're fully liable. I mean, how else would it be? You're not going to hold a passenger of an airplane liable when an airplane goes down.
Absolutely.
As I always say, what's the difference between a tube with wings and a box with wheels? At the end of the day, it's just a thing getting some people in a container from A to B.
And how do you think the insurance companies...
They're going to love this.
They're going to love this.
I have a rather unpopular opinion about this.
Tell me about it.
Everyone's been talking about for years that this is going to be the end of the insurance industry. I actually, maybe naively, admittedly, I'm not an expert on insurance by any means, but I don't know, I think it's actually going to be great because now, I mean, look, you're not going to be going after individuals. You're going to be going after really deep pockets from all these companies and suppliers and manufacturers. They're going to have a field day. So whenever things go wrong, which admittedly will occur less frequently, but when they do go wrong, we're going to be talking massive, massive chunks of money, right? So you're going to be able to go after the hardware manufacturers, the software manufacturers. You're not going to go after some guy driving his kid to school. It's going to be a very different sort of a thing. So I think it's actually going to be really great for the insurance industry if they play it right. An analogy to that is something like freeway side hotels or motels. So in the US, we have a popular chain of really awful but convenient motels called Motel 6. They're typically $60 to $100 a night. They're everywhere scattered across our interstate freeways. And so one of the concerns has been, well, what's going to happen to them? Right? Because if you're in an autonomous vehicle, a little pod of some sort, why would you ever have to stop? I mean, it's really no different to a train or an airplane at that point, right? And I agree. But to me, it seems likely that you're just going to have these guys basically developing their own they're basically going to white label their own brand of Motel 6 branded autonomous pod cars. I mean, Lufthansa did the same thing with their buses. My wife and I took one the other day from Munich airport here to Munich. It's a Lufthansa bus. Why not?
Why not? Yeah. Do you see right now the industry is not, in my opinion, is not in terms of safety quite ready to roll out full autonomous vehicle? What's your take on that?
We need to slightly more narrowly tailor the question. In what sense do you mean? I mean, public acceptance, society, the legal system.
I was talking from technical perspective.
Okay. Well,
but I would like to know from legal perspective.
Okay. So Elon says we are now hardware ready with version 3.0 of Tesla Autopilot hardware. We are now only software limited, which is a pretty bold claim when you think about it. Talk to everybody else and they will never make such a claim. They're going to say, yeah, we are still both hardware and software limited. Okay. Legally, I think that we actually are perfectly capable legally. We have the necessary framework. What concerns me, and I say concerns, what kind of alarms me is the degree to which we are throwing up obstacles that don't need to exist. So what I mean is, you talk about the trolley paradox, which I hope we don't get into again. We can. You got the trolley paradox. You got people asking these questions like, what happens if somebody jumps in front of an autonomous car? And all these ridiculous questions. And these aren't new questions. We've been dealing with these things since the beginning of, since horses and carriages. Right. So I don't know why people are throwing these up in the air like these are some novel new questions to be solved. So yeah, I think the framework is there just fine. But I think that for some reason, society as a whole is sort of fabricating and exaggerating problems that don't need to be there. We've got much bigger, true problems to focus on.
Yeah, absolutely, I agree with you.
To be clear, sorry, I'm not saying that we shouldn't flesh these out and make them explicit. I'm just saying those aren't the big challenges.
Those challenges even exist today.
Yeah.
Absolutely. What if someone jumps in front of your car when a human driving, yeah?
Well, or I would say a rather more direct analogy. I would say, what do we do today if somebody jumps in front of a subway?
Yeah.
Or a train?
So those are not new problems. We have them today. And the autonomous driving will just make it better. It's not going to make it worse. This is the hope. Having said that, what's your idea? I mean, you talked about Elon Musk. He even mentioned that rolling out full level 4 this year. We know it's not going to happen.
It's going to happen eventually, but not this year.
It's going to happen eventually. In Germany, we think about 2050. Some people say 2050.
For Elon's level 4 now?
I mean, fully autonomous.
Full level 5.
Not Elon's level 4,
okay.
But fully autonomous in the whole way. Some people say 2025. We have all the way from 2025 to 2050. I really like our chancellor when she talks about in 20 years you will need a special license to drive.
Of course.
Yeah, I really like that.
Absolutely.
What is the timeline you think is realistic?
Let me just begin by saying I really wish we would just all kind of, and I say we, I mean collectively, like the entire planet, would just stop talking about level 5. I think this is a really silly, pointless, totally useless discussion. Here's why. We don't need it, like at all. I'm totally on board and I can't wait till it occurs. I just think it's completely irrelevant, unnecessary, and a complete distraction. And it's really little more than just sort of marketing gimmick. So what really matters and what we really need and what we can succeed at very, very soon is really broadly geofenced level 4. As soon as we wrap our heads around the fact that these really aren't anything more than virtual trains. I mean, honestly, tell me, like, what's the difference between a train on, well, tracks and a tightly or broadly geofenced level 4 car? Like, literally, actually, this is a question, like, what's the difference?
There is no difference, literally.
Okay, there's no difference. So I'm gonna say what I've said to several others in the past without giving names, but there's a few companies, and I've said this to them before. I was like, you guys could like literally win the AV race right now, today, if you would just stop sort of promising this ridiculous thing of deploying level 5 before the end of the year, work with city governments, get your level 4 cars deployed on, like, I don't know, transit lane, bus lanes, on a few streets here, a few lanes of big boulevards or freeways there. Just do this, start carrying revenue passengers, and you will win. Game over.
Right. Absolutely.
Why is nobody doing this? Like, I just don't get it.
To that point, in Bavaria, the idea is to build an autonomous lane.
I've read about this. Yeah, some freeways are doing this already. So China's doing this as well, and that's perfect, yes.
That's perfect.
Yeah.
That is something that's going to happen soon. There is no doubt about it. Yeah. The question is, what do people understand when we talk about AV? What I've seen in the past, when technology comes over, there is a massive lack in the public awareness. They massively misunderstand technology. Yeah. And I think due to a lot of commercials from the OEMs, people massively misunderstand autonomous vehicle today.
But, I mean, in the public's defense, quite frankly, they shouldn't have to really get it. So what I mean is, didn't Steve Jobs say this over and over again? That nobody really cares about megahertz and gigabytes and whatever, just does the thing work? Does it do what I need? Right. There's this really fantastic organization I met with in DC over the summer. They're called PAVE, the Pathway to Autonomous Vehicle Education. And their whole mission is precisely that. It's to kind of educate the public and teach them what's what about a car. And I talked with somebody not too long ago who only just recently discovered that their Mercedes GLC has active lane keep assist, which for all intents and purposes is basically a really elementary Tesla autopilot system. It works pretty well. I mean, people, they didn't even know that their car did that. And when it accidentally did it, they were like, totally shocked, like, oh my God, my car is driving itself, And the point that I'm making is I'm not even sure necessarily that the public needs to, nobody really cares how a thing works, simply that it does.
I totally agree with you. What I was trying to say is the problem is the expectation. What do you expect the technology to do?
Work.
So when work, what does that mean? So when you show that your dog is on the steering wheel and you're sleeping, and you expect that you can get away with watching Harry Potter in the car, that's deadly.
True.
So I think the awareness should be gradual, and we have to be very careful because there is a difference between an iPod and a vehicle. If you misunderstand, expect something too much from your iPod, your life is not in danger.
True.
So
if you listen to the wrong music, it could be
you can listen to the wrong music.
That's possible.
That's possible.
Okay. No, I get your point, and I agree, obviously. But so there's a weird paradox. Actually, I just learned this term the other day. You may have heard about this. It's called, the paradox of safety. And as soon as if you've not heard the term, I think the concept is immediately clear. The more safe a thing becomes, the more risk people are willing to take, right?
True.
To me, that best, I guess, describes the biggest problem with autonomous cars. So having driven a Tesla on autopilot many times, So for example, late at night, a 1 hour drive, say from Silicon Valley up to San Francisco, there's no cars on the road, you've got autopilot switched on, la-di-da, you don't have to do anything. It actually really does work that well, for the most part, until it doesn't. But what you become really painfully aware of is the fact that, gosh, you could very easily fall asleep. And that's pretty scary because, and that is the paradox, right?
Right.
Because you realize you could easily fall asleep. Ironically, you're probably less likely to die if you did fall asleep, but you are more likely to fall asleep than in a regular car. That to me is the big challenge to overcome.
Yeah, I think what you mentioned is really the steps. The next step is really geofenced lanes for AV, and then we'll have to take it because we'll also be gathering a lot of massive amount of data.
Well, that too, yeah.
Yeah, and the industry will be learning, and this is how it should progress. Now, for our audience, can you talk a little bit about the trolley paradox?
Oh boy, here we go. Okay, let's, look, the trolley paradox, here's the problem, right? First of all, when was the last, literally you specifically, when have you ever had to think to yourself, should I run over grandpa, little kid, or kill myself? Have you ever been faced with that dilemma?
I haven't, and I have
Okay,
asked this question to my audience.
Okay.
Nobody in the audience ever
Nobody
did.
in the audience, exactly.
Right,
okay.
This is exactly
look,
it.
and
That's
by the way,
point.
I know people listening are saying, yeah, but Mark, these are why they're called corner cases and fringe cases
this
and
is
blah, blah,
corner
blah.
cases.
I get it, but even corner cases have to have some basis in reality.
Yeah.
Okay, number two, whether it's you, a human driver, or whether it's an autonomous car, if you're faced with this dilemma, you've already failed. It's like game over. That just shouldn't have happened in the first place. Third and finally, you cannot pretend to think that you can program ethics into a car, because that is also a failure. And when I say failure, what I mean is because it can't be done, or at least it shouldn't be done. MIT did that great study not too long ago, right? So just looking as between, say, the US and China, there was a very incredibly fascinating, and again, I think there's like a whole bunch of really awesome doctoral theses to be written on this stuff. It's really fascinating stuff in a classroom. In the US, for instance, people are, they're always going to protect the little kid rather than the elderly person. And in China, it's the exact opposite. Respect your elders. So there's such a, just this binary distinction as between different cultures that you can't program this stuff in. Or even if you could, you shouldn't.
You've been studying the AV industry. You are an attorney. So tell us about law for autonomous vehicle. How should it look like? How should the framework look like? How should we develop it?
So the neat thing about autonomous vehicle law is it's not a whole new body of law. It's not like, we've got constitutional law, criminal law, products liability law. This is basically a scenario where we can take first year law, kind of remix it and use it as a framework to kind of guide us for the autonomous vehicle world. So just to kind of touch on a few examples without getting overly academic, whether you're talking about somebody jumping in front of a trolley or whether you're talking about, say, negligence generally, you're going to have all these same basic issues that can be applied directly to autonomous cars. I mean, we already have these things in place today. It's just a matter of applying them to autonomous cars. It's not a new thing.
It's contextualizing it.
Yeah. I have heard some pretty good, arguments that because there's a knowledge that autonomous cars will explicitly be programmed not to hit people, there is a pretty good argument to be made. What happens if a bunch of bad actors decide to, surround an autonomous car? Literally prevent it from moving, right? And then they could break in and hurt the occupants. Yeah, that's probably what would happen. On the other hand, again, we have the same thing with trains. I was actually on a train once in France where the train came to a stop on the tracks because some guy was standing on the tracks. What's the difference?
Is there any legislation that that we should be aware of that's taking place? How is the legislating community progressing with this?
Well, frankly, it hasn't progressed at all. I mean, in the U.S. at least. Again, I'm only speaking to the U.S., right? So we've been, both the House and the Senate have been trying and failing at coming up with some really good broad sweeping legislation, and it's just not really happening. I will share with you where I think things need to be headed, if you'd like.
Sure.
So folks who listen to my podcast have probably heard this a few times, but I really firmly believe that we need eventually to have, again, at least in the US, I mean, you look internationally, so you've got the IACO for aviation and the IATA, I guess, and in the US, you've got the FAA. Eventually, we're going to need to have an FAVA. We're absolutely going to need this sort of federal regulation, which is going to do all the things that don't currently exist. Set the standards, the definitions, advise on the technologies, mandate the technologies, because today people are asking this question, for instance, to LiDAR or not to LiDAR, right? Talk to Elon and he says, no, LiDAR is a fool's errand. Look, maybe he's right, maybe he's not. At the end of the day, it just takes a test. Let's just find out whether that computer vision is good enough. That's what needs to be done, and no one's doing it yet. And the reason this is so important going forward is because when you end up in a world where humans aren't driving, you need this sort of regulatory framework, to your original question at the start of this talk, whom to target for liability issues. And it's a pretty complicated thing. It's arguably more complicated even than getting to the moon, getting to Mars. And we've got to do things right from the beginning. And my big concern is that if we don't do things right from the beginning, we end up delaying it. And when you're losing, as I say in the States, I like to very morbidly remind people that in the US, we're losing the equivalent, roughly, of a 9/11 tragedy every month. And I've said this to a lot of people, and they just kind of like, oh, that's an interesting way of looking at it. But it's true. So we can't delay this. If this were any other thing in life, this would have been outlawed years ago.
If we do not have legislation or too little legislation, we have a problem. How about, we have seen in the industry is really progressing technologically, then legislation kind of slows it down. So do you think that could also potentially happen?
Yeah, sure. Of course. I think the easy answer is always to shy away from legislation. We don't want to slow things down, I agree. But, to the point earlier, for once, that's not happening yet. For once, government, again, at least in the US, is being impressively hands-off. And that's great. All I'm saying, though, is that once we reach that point where we are able to deploy level 4, then we need to kind of take stock of our situation and say, okay, hold on. How do we want to actually do this? How are we going to answer these questions about liability? How are we going to answer the questions about standards and safety and the bare minimum? So okay, here's a good example, right? So in aviation, one of the coolest things in aviation, I think, is that the concept of mean time till failure for a twin-engine jet today is so vanishingly small that it's a meaningless statistic. As I always like to say, that your safest place within the globe of the Earth is within an airplane at cruising altitude. There is no meaningful calculation anymore for predicting when both engines will fail. And this is thanks to all the legislation. There's a reason why every aircraft has triple and quadruply redundant systems. It's because this was mandated. And to Tesla's credit, they've got now redundant systems for their entire motherboard, right? The new Tesla version 3 hardware, it's got 2 identical motherboards totally separate to one another. But these things need to be mandated, not like, oh, hey, the company's going to say, hey, we're going to do this, and the other companies may not. These are the things that have to be regulated to make autonomous vehicles as safe as aviation has been.
Love that. Here are two things that I want to get into. You probably talked about a Boeing example where we could track back to the manufacturer of the supplier. Now, in terms of number, when it comes to AV, there'll be way too many incidences.
That's a good point.
That's one. So,
or not if they're done right.
Not if they're done right. So, as you said, if they're not done in the beginning, it's going to be too late for a lot of people. Second, automotive industry is one of the most cost-sensitive industry. What happens is, in aviation industry, they spend 30,000 euro per ECU. Automotive industry wants us, suppliers like Matrickz, to make that ECU for $10 per ECU.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So you gave an example of Tesla's redundancy.
I see where you're going with this.
Yeah. What do you think of this cost and in terms of the volume? It's going to be different than aviation.
Yeah,
industry.
But here's the thing. The reason it works in aviation is because passengers aren't owning the planes. You see where I'm going with this, right? Let's not forget that the future of automation presupposes 3 conditions: automation, electrification, and sharing. It cannot be the case. It must not. It must be legally mandated not to be the case that we allow a primarily individual ownership model to persist. I'm sure you've heard the model or the study by BCG and the World Economic Forum in Boston, that if we had autonomous cars but no car sharing, traffic congestion and commensurate travel times would increase by like 5.6%, which may not sound like a lot, but this is going to be a snowball effect. So if nobody's owning cars, now suddenly the cost can go up. And Elon actually suggested this, right, where the cost of a Model 3 will effectively, what did he say, 100K or 200K for a Model, no, more than that even, right? And that's the point, is that if you're not owning a car, alternatively, even if you are owning one, it's going to be driving around picking people up. So the net cost will be negative, meaning you're going to actually make money off of it. But you're right, I agree. It will be cost prohibitive, but that's good. We want the cars to be cost prohibitive. We don't want people to own them. And so what's going to happen is eventually owning any autonomous car will be a pure luxury good. So really, ownership of an autonomous car will be like people who own a chauffeured vehicle or something. That's how it needs to be.
Do you think drone technology is going to play a role? Will that also be, because unmanned aerial vehicle is already out there, manned one are in progress. There are wonderful startups in Munich area working on that. So they're saying that the future luxury will be your private jet. What do you think of that?
Sure, I think for some people. I mean, today some people, they have private yachts and jets and helicopters and soon spaceships.
Well, what do they actually mean is that they will be, if they mass produce,
for the masses, for everybody.
They'll be able to produce you can buy a vehicle.
I'm happy to go on the record and be proven wrong one day. Yeah. I don't really see it happening. I mean, I think there will definitely be a use case. I think there will definitely be a market for some autonomous drones shuttling people around some places, sure. Do I think it's going to replace other modes of transit? No way. If only for basic physics. I mean, it would be really annoying to have a bunch of things buzzing around, producing all this downwash from rotors. I mean, that would just be annoying. So if only for that, I just don't see it happening. But besides that, it's another layer of complexity that I think is kind of unnecessary. In contrast, I think it's a lot easier a solution to solve autonomous cars generally on the road, platooning together, perfectly optimized to get from A to B, and indeed, when I say optimized, never being empty. So even if that requires then the usage of the big T word, taxes, an occupancy tax, right? So if you've got an empty pod car driving around not carrying passengers, you should be heavily taxed, penalized, fined, whatever you want to call it. But there's precedent for this, right? At least in the US, and I think, actually I don't know if in Germany you have the idea of carpool lanes or if you get reductions for tolls. So in the US you have these carpool lanes where, well, if you've got a passenger, it's free, and if you don't have a passenger, you pay more, or you can't be in the lane at all. So there is precedent for occupancy generally. So you mandate this stuff, and the optimal solution, the optimal endgame is a bunch of autonomous cars platooning together, always with at least one or two occupants.
Uber has an interesting vision on that. They want to do both. They want to go all in autonomous vehicles.
Do all the things.
And also on drones.
That's fine.
And stuff. And probably the future will be a combination of both. Yeah. And as you said, zero occupancy. Yeah. You take people from one part to the other.
Also, as a startup guy, you know what I always say? Try all the things.
Try all the things.
See what works.
See what works.
If you can afford it, do it.
All right. So one last question. Sure. What do you think in next 5-10 years, due to this disruption in the automotive industry, is going to be the most positive aspect for humanity?
I say it's a good question because I'm not sure that we're going to see a really positive impact in 5 or 10 years for humanity as a whole. I think we're going to see a really cool impact with respect to the industry laying the framework for what will become a good impact on humanity. Meaning, to the point earlier, I think we are going to finally see the first level 4 deployment for revenue passengers actually within 5 years. And that'll be great. But unless we have regulation that actually starts to mandate, so one of the things, going back to my thing about having an FAVA and needing more government regulation, one thing we forgot to mention briefly was my hope, contrary to your valid concern that regulation could stifle innovation, my hope and indeed my expectation is that regulation will actually expedite things. So my hope and my expectation is that eventually we're going to have regulation that actually fast tracks the deployment of AVs. And so if all goes well, then this will all start to take off at a faster and faster pace. And so conservatively, then what I'm really anticipating is that, and this is a rather big delta for the estimation, but somewhere in the 2060 to 2080 range, we should see mostly a full replacement of human-driven cars. In most urban,
2080.
Yeah, roughly. Borderline. Right? And I'm sort of extrapolating out of the proxy of the replacement rate for regular vehicles by electric vehicles, Elon already did the math. I mean, it's easy to do the math, right? Extrapolate out from there, be super conservative. Somewhere in that range, I would anticipate, with the help of regulation, not despite it, but with its help, we'll see this happen. That's when things are going to get very cool.
I'm sure from this there will be no new questions coming and stuff. Yeah.
So, well, that's the great thing about this space. I mean, I think, well, to the point of how you opened this and why I say it's the greatest step change in humanity, I mean, what is more dynamic today? Okay, apart from maybe medical advancements, this is really potentially the biggest, most important thing. Not only are you saving lives, you're making lives a lot easier. Yes, there's a lot of unanswered questions. What are we going to do with the truck drivers, the taxi drivers who lose their jobs? What's going to happen when the suburbs end up becoming more expensive because now it's not an inconvenience to live away from the city? Where do people go for cheaper housing? There's a lot of questions that frankly no one's asking yet, and certainly nobody has answers for yet. But on net, we have to believe and pursue this vastly superior future, and that's just what makes it so cool.
I love it. To that point, I have to ask you another question.
Sure.
This technological visionary Salim Ismail, who wrote a fantastic book, and he always talks about AVs and stuff, and he makes one point that real estate price is going to go down because of AV. Down because space won't matter. You will be able to stay farther away because of two technologies, not only AV, also because of drones and stuff. You will be able to live farther away from the city. Space won't matter. It would be cheap to transport from one place to the other. What do you think of that? Because what you were pointing out is the other way.
Yeah, I think exactly the opposite.
You think exactly the opposite.
Like, why are suburbs cheaper? I mean, you're getting a bigger home. You're getting an actual yard. You can have like a 17-car garage and a pool and a jacuzzi and whatever. But it's cheaper than living in a city where you get like a box and no garage. Why? Well, because people are willing to. I mean, they cost less because it's a hassle to live far away because you have like a 2-hour commute. My point is that the beautiful thing about AVs is that they will literally delete the concept of a commute. So the fact that you're 2 hours away, it's not going to matter anymore, because eventually the end game for autonomous cars is they will only be a car by name, by virtue of the fact they have 4 wheels and a cabin. But let's face it, what will they really be? They will just be an extension to your home, mobile extension, or to put a funny way of it, it's basically a mobile home.
Mobile office.
Which we've admittedly had forever, and a big camper home, right? But that is effectively what it is. And so if the concept of commuting is no longer a thing, and that was the thing which kept prices down because it was a trade-off, right? Sure, we're going to give you a big home for less money, but hey, the downside is you have to commute for 2 hours. But if the commute's no longer a hassle, if that's no longer a pain point, then why should the price stay lower? You're getting a quiet place, a bigger place, a nicer place, and by the way, you can sleep or work or do whatever you like in your little autonomous pod thing, which by the way, will likely not park in your garage, obviously, but it'll basically dock in a receptacle and effectively be another room to your house. A small room, but a room. So I don't know. That's an interesting take. I had not heard that actually.
So his point is, we have plenty of space that we could use far away from the city. People are concentrated around the city because of the commute. When the commute is not an issue, they don't even mind going further. That's his point. And I totally understand your point too. We'll have to wait and see what happens.
Yeah, although let's face it, if that does end up being the case, then that really necessitates what we discussed earlier, which is that we cannot allow these things to be privately owned and without occupants.
Right.
Because it's just going to make traffic catastrophically bad.
Marc, thank you so much for being here. It was fascinating having you. We hope to see you again.
My pleasure. Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you.
In this podcast show, we bring in the industry leaders and experts in the automotive domain to share their experiences along their journey. The mission of our podcast is to start a dialogue that will allow us to understand the development of automotive industry and where the automotive industry is going. You can ask questions to our guests directly. Just send us an email to podcast@matrix.de. We'll schedule a call with you during the recording and you'll be part of our show. Make sure you subscribe so that you don't miss any new episodes. Please share this video to help others get enlightened as well, and that would mean a great deal to us. See you in the next episode.